Welcome to Green Building Matters, the original and most popular podcast focused on the green building movement. Your host is Charlie Cicchetti, one of the most credentialed experts in the green building industry and one of the few to be honored as a LEED Fellow. Each week, Charlie welcomes a green building professional from around the globe to share their war stories, career advice, and unique insight into how sustainability is shaping the built environment. So settle in, grab a fresh cup of coffee, and get ready to find out why green building matters.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to the next episode of the Green Building Matters podcast. So excited for 2023. Gosh, looking back over the last few years, I've got to interview just some incredible green building professionals all over the world, some I call friends, and I've really gotten to know Pia, some work I'd gotten to do with the Sweden Green Building Council actually before the pandemic, and just so excited to get a peek into what's going on in and around Sweden. So today, my special guest is Pia Ohrling, and she is a LEED Fellow outside of Stockholm, Sweden. Pia, how are you doing today?
Oh, I'm fine. Thanks. I'm actually in the countryside right now. In Dalsland, and it's been a snowstorm yesterday, so we got loads of snow.
Oh my gosh, I bet the snow there is probably different than what I have here in the U.S. So it's probably beautiful there. And thank you for making time for us today. Just for our podcast listeners on the Green Building Matters podcast, my hope as we continue with our podcast is just some encouragement as they get to listen into a cool story like yours. So Pia, take us back though. Like, where did you grow up and where did you go to school?
Yeah, I grew up where I am now in Dalsland, Sweden. It's sort of on the west side of Sweden, close to Norway. And it's if you go back many hundred years, it was Norway actually here. Wow. So it's sort of a border country. So it's been Norway or Sweden or whatever.
And then when did what did you decide to do for, say, college? Did you know you wanted to stay in that area or you wanted to venture out?
No, I went to school here first, but I wanted to become an architect actually. And then I needed to do buildings. And so then I had to move to Karlstad, which is a bit like 100 kilometers from here. So I went to school there until I was like 18, 19 something. And after that, it was university. And then I moved to Stockholm.
Oh, fantastic. And so maybe architecture, then buildings, later even added on advanced studies with civil engineering. So what led you to buildings? Did you have any influence growing up there? How'd you know you wanted to work in and around buildings?
Well, sort of lots of my family are in the industry. So my grandfather was painting houses, and also he was a hobby painter for doing art as well. And my father's uncle was a tiler. And my father, he was like a construction manager at building sites. So I started to work at building sites in summers when I was maybe like 15 or something. And I've done that all through my studies too, working at construction sites.
Well, that definitely had influence for you. And so, all right, sustainability, that's how you and I have gotten to know each other. So when did that first show up for you?
Yeah, of course, I didn't become an architect. I became a civil engineer instead. And I started to work at Sweden's largest consultancy company. And I worked with more like project management then. And then one day, someone asked the question, if we had someone that could do audits for dangerous substances in buildings, like asbestos, PCBs, lead, etc. And I hadn't done that, so I didn't say yes. But then an older man, he said yes. And I knew that he had never done such things. So then I just said, well, I can do it too. And I started to study those things. And then I became sort of an expert in auditing buildings.
On the environmental audits. And the way to go, way to put yourself out there too is, hey, who better than me to do that?
I thought so.
I love it. Related to that, so let's still talk kind of early career. So you're a civil engineer, you're getting into the environmental side. But to get to that point, did you have any mentors along the way?
No, I didn't, because environment wasn't so big then.
I see. And so you really had to, figure it out on your own and learn. So where were you learning at the time about sustainability and maybe later programs like LEED? Where did you first start learning about those?
Well, in school we had like very few courses. It was more about ISO 14000 a little bit. So it was sort of just starting. So there wasn't so much. So I started working with environment, like I said, these environmental audits, and also we did sustainability or environmental programs for buildings. So many property owners wanted to have sustainability programs. So we developed our own sort of, and there they had programs too, that things that they were. So, yeah.
I see. No, thank you for that, because you kind of had to create your own before these other programs were existing. So tell us about the companies, though, and your work at the large consulting firm, and then you went to WSP. And so kind of connect the dots. Like, how were you changing your career there at that time?
Well, I worked first at Sweco, which is like the largest consultancy company. And then I moved to WSP. And it was then I started to work with certifications when they first came to Sweden.
Yeah, you were one of the first in your region. I know that. I've learned that about you. And so probably a little later then, I know you got involved with the Sweden Green Building Council. So tell us about the certifications there. It sounds like, 2006 to 2010, a good 5 years there at WSP with certifications. Was it LEED? Was it Millie Brignet? Like what was happening? What kind of certifications? What kind of buildings?
Well, we had we had quite a few sort of certification systems, but everyone was per each consultancy firm. So WSP had one system called environmental status, and it was quite big. It was like many hundreds of buildings that had gone through that. It wasn't sort of a certification, it was more like a stamp. But it was a bit difficult to have so many different systems. So then Sweden Green Building Council started and everything, and they started to develop a Swedish system, which is the Miljöbyggnad system. But it took quite a while, and at the same time, BREEAM started to be interesting for Swedish projects.
Okay.
So sort of all of these came at the same time.
Wow. So how did you say you had a client that had a project, a building, and there's all these options? I mean, I learned this when I was in Sweden with you a few years ago, teaching the 2-day WELL AP class, which again, by the way, that was amazing. Thank you. There's so many options, especially where you are. Do you have to run a feasibility study and show a client the costs and the pros and cons? And, how does that decision-making happen?
Well, at the start, it was more that the companies had decided. So companies that had some connection to the US, they wanted to do LEED, like Skanska. Because Skanska is a Swedish company, but they have a large business in America. So they wanted to do LEED. And then the other large construction company, NCC, of course, they wanted to do BREEAM, sort of to be opposite, maybe.
That makes sense. Okay. Well, just what were they more used to? What did they have more ties? And thank you for that. That makes a lot of sense. So let's keep talking a little bit career, and we'll come back to probably the Sweden Green Building Council. But tell us about your company there and what made you want to go that route. And how's that been? 13 years now.
Yeah, it was. Well, I had worked on like the two largest consultancy companies, and then I wanted to change again. And it was actually my husband who wanted to start his own business, but he works with sales, so it's so much more difficult. So he said, why don't you start your own business?
Yeah,
it's like the simplest thing as a consultant.
And then you did. And now tell us about your business and what do you really specialize in, and what are some of your favorite projects to work on?
Yeah, we specialize in sustainability and we do a lot of certifications. And my favorite projects are the ones that really want to do change, not just certify. I sort of say no to when they just want to certify, the lowest level.
Absolutely. No, I agree. Yeah. Especially when we've been in this for a long time. So let's make a difference, make change, and unique projects, communities. So let's look back. One more question to kind of look back, Pia, is what are some of your proudest accomplishments?
Well, of course, it's difficult. Of course, the first ever buildings are quite nice, like the first ever LEED certified building in Sweden. It was actually pre-certification that we was first with. So it was nice. The first ever BREEAM in Use International certification, and that was Sweden's first BREEAM SC certification. And I also done Norway's first BREEAM in Use Norway and Iceland's first BREEAM in Use. So these are, of course, nice.
First, yeah.
Nice to be first.
Sure. Those are amazing firsts. And then, you're a LEED fellow. Congratulations. I know that's a big deal. What has that meant to you?
Well, I didn't sort of know what to expect so much. Of course, Sue, who's working with me, she's already a LEED fellow. So she helped me through everything. But I think it's really nice that those things that you do, that you connect people and have those meetings where we could discuss things. You get sort of a connection, a bigger picture of things.
You're right. Thank you for that. And Sue's the best. So for anyone curious, we've had Sue Clark on as well on the podcast. And just, it is a community within a community, right? We've got everyone that's passionate about green buildings. And then we've got the LEED fellow groups, been doing this a while. And how do we share best practices and pro tips? So glad that you're in our LEED fellow community. Any other kind of proud accomplishments as you look back?
Yeah, of course. We have two nice projects in Sweden that I've done for Vasakronan and LEED. And they were the first LEED version 4 projects in Sweden. So, because it wasn't so difficult to get LEED Platinum in the older version. But when we started in version 4, it was much harder. So those projects, then Celsius, where we had to go beyond. So we had to do rainwater flushing of toilets, which is very uncommon in Sweden. It's becoming more common now due to those projects, among others.
Yeah,
so those are nice.
For everybody, yeah. Those are some amazing accomplishments for you. Thank you.
Yeah, and also we actually changed LEED in those projects because version 4 was difficult at start. Like, for instance, we could not score on daylight because the criteria were written so northern countries couldn't score on daylight.
Oh, wow. Yeah. Oh, you're right. LEED's not a one-size-fits-all. Sometimes these credits are very difficult in different areas.
Yeah, so then we did the ACP, which after that they changed the LEED criteria after our ACP. So, and some other things too that we changed in the criteria that we saw that were not so good.
Sure. I'm glad that you had that influence there. Okay, so let's fast forward to today, present day. So what's keeping you busy today?
Oh, yeah, we have lots of projects. In Sweden now, though, times are getting a bit tougher since it's a war in Ukraine and we have like soaring high energy prices and material prices are going up and inflation. So many projects might get halted for a while, actually. But
that is a big challenge. You're right. It's right there, your neighbor, and it has a lot bigger influence than we might think. So I guess you priced out the projects, they will happen, but it's a question of when or pause or come back to it later. I know you've got a lot of active projects. You've got your team and you've got your work with the Sweden Green Building Council too. So can you talk a little bit about that and what are some initiatives there?
At Sweden Green Building Council, yes, I'm helping out as a LEED expert there. Well, I'm not sure exactly. I have to think a bit now. Happening there. Yeah, there are, of course, new versions coming. Most systems are now, as fast as possible, adapting to the EU taxonomy regulations. So it's only LEED that's lagging a little bit, but I think they are putting effort in aligning LEED also with the taxonomy, which is necessary. Otherwise, LEED won't be so good to use in Sweden. Or Europe.
Yeah, the taxonomy and the European Green Deal, you've got a lot of work and future versions of LEED and all the programs. So, you're that expert, that liaison back to the Sweden Green Building Council. And to our listeners, while LEED, came out of the U.S. Green Building Council, there's the World Green Building Council, and so many countries have their own Green Building Council, like here in Sweden, that really for sustainability and green buildings. And Pia spends some of her time there. So anything else with projects or in your community or just doing sustainability in your region, Pia, you want to hit on?
Yes, I think it's quite interesting in Sweden right now, because I think, Greta Thunberg, who's Swedish, has had a big impact on our business in Sweden. And so many companies now, they do sustainability more for real. Because before it was like they wanted the stamp, but maybe they didn't have the heart in the sustainability. But that's changing, which is really nice. So we do climate calculations in many projects now, and reuse is getting really big. So I have one project with Vasakronan that is a reuse project where we take down, what do you call them? Plaster walls, gypsum walls.
Yeah.
So we take those down, then build new walls of them and just change the inner and outer plasterboard.
I see. Okay. No, you're right. It's one thing to build just new out of the ground with eco-friendly materials. It's better to reuse buildings and, of course, materials. So that's amazing. So let's talk about, Pia, the future. I'd love to hear your story and your shift towards engineering and buildings and environmental, and you put your name out there early, and you did that, your company, your entrepreneurship. And let's talk about the future. So, what are you excited about? Where do you think the green building and even healthy building movement, where are we going next?
Well, I think all certification systems, LEED, BREEAM, etc., they really need to change because there's too much focus on small details that takes a lot of time and effort. So they need to change and look more at the bigger picture and really do change. That is what I think is most important of all.
That's a good point. I mean, it's, LEED, it's been around for over 20 years now, and it's been a great tool. We're on LEED version, 4.1. There's talk of version 5 in the next 12 to 18 months. And, you have to continue to evolve and raise the bar. But I think I would agree with you. It's not always the small stuff. It needs to be the big stuff. So what would you consider some of the big stuff? Is it carbon? Is it ESG? Is it equity? I mean, where do we need to get it right with these rating systems going forward?
Of course, carbon, reuse and recycling, and biodiversity. Because I see a big thing there, because you look at climate and then you think, okay, we'll need to build everything in wood instead. But then in Sweden, we have a big debate now on the forest companies, not being so sustainable and cutting down all old forests. So then we lose biodiversity instead.
No, I can tell you're passionate about all those, but especially the biodiversity. It's what we see. It's right there. It's that connection to nature. And it's not just bringing it inside, it's protecting it. And what do we have around us? So you're right. Some of those might be just worth a few points, and they maybe should be weighted more.
I think sometimes we think solutions are too easy. We think that, we can do that. We'll just change to this way. But sustainability isn't that simple. It's like so many things you need to think about, like biodiversity. It's no quick fix.
No, you're right. Gosh. Okay, so big rating system updates. Let's make sure we get it right on the most important topics and not get too hung up on the small details. I agree. I think to our listeners, that needs to be a big part of the future here in this green building movement. So Pia, let's get to know you a little more. What would you say is your specialty or gift? Well,
I thought about that. And I think one of my gifts for working with certification is that I'm like a speed reader.
Oh, yeah.
So reading those manuals and interpreting them, of course, that's helped me a lot.
Oh, I love that. Yeah, because it's technical reading, right? It's not a fiction novel. It's technical. You got to understand it, use it, and apply it. And then with clients and architects and engineers, you have to decipher it and kind of help them understand it, right? So,
yeah, I actually heard something that, who is he again? He calls himself the godfather of green. Do you know whom I'm speaking of?
Roger Watson? No, there's a couple. There's a few that.
he was working with LEED from the start, and then he sort of changed around. I think he has some podcast of things too. You probably would know who it is, but
yeah, David Gottfried. You're talking about David Gottfried, I think.
Yeah, he said something that he said that the systems were going the wrong way because they're like the Bible or the Quran, and you need like me to interpret it. So the systems need to change so people easier can understand them. And I think that's really correct because they need people like me to interpret. And I think that should change too.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, I'm hearing that over and over. Let's keep it simpler. Now, we still want it to be where you have to, work towards it, right? To get a certification, maybe to go towards LEED Platinum, but make it a little easier for more to understand. So you don't need the interpreter, if you will. So that's
because the sort of this LEED, BREEAM, and the systems, they've done so much good, sort of, because they've shown the path and they're really like good tools because they evoke the competition in people. So one more point and then we'll be in platinum. And so they're really good. But I see a tendency to that reviewers are getting more detail focused. In the start, it was more like, okay, you met intent, but so that's the next.
That's what we all need. I agree. And that leans into your specialty or gift. And so let's talk about a bucket list. I'm a fan of a bucket list. I realize not everybody has a bucket list, but are there one or two things maybe you could share that are on your bucket list? Any travel or adventure? Do you want to write a book?
Well, in Sweden, I've seen that there's a change sort of with social media and everything. So some people get a lot of space because they're good at LinkedIn or Twitter or whatever. And many people like me who are older and experienced, they're not so used to those new media. So we are not heard. So that's one of my things that I've decided to be more on social media and influence that way, because if I can help more projects be more sustainable.
That's fantastic. Any destinations, though, that you do want to travel to? Any countries you haven't been to you want to?
Travel is so difficult nowadays because you always think of also the big carbon impact.
That's true.
But like when I went to San Francisco to the LEED fellow, then I was thinking too that if I go to San Francisco, if I can learn people in other countries something that we're good at in Sweden, like help them, or if I can learn something from other, then of course those carbon impacts from my travels will be just a small bit compared to what you can sort of save carbon-wise.
That's a good point.
So what I think is it would be really nice to be able to go and spread more knowledge, because I think we're quite far ahead in Sweden, some countries. So if we could spread that knowledge to US, Canada, and of course many other countries too, that would be nice.
So important. And I know you're an excellent teacher. And the theme of my podcast here over the last almost 5 years now, actually exactly 5 years, is teach everything you know. And I have these T-shirts. So next time I see you, I'll give you one that says teach everything you know. And I think you and I have that in common. We've got Okay, so just a few more questions here. I'm loving to get to know you more. Is there a book or a documentary you might recommend to our audience?
I will go and get that book because I'm just reading one now that I really like.
Good. So probably good reading with all the snow on the ground and in the countryside, and get a good book. And all of our podcast listeners, we put the book recommendations in the show notes so you can link over to these.
Yeah, I got some for Christmas, of course, books. So I've just started reading one now, which is actually about America, and it's called The Four Winds, I think. And that's really interesting because it's about America during the 1930s when there was like no rain in Texas and a lot of countryside where there were a lot of farmers, and it was also the Depression, so they had to go to California and how they were treated when they came there. It's really interesting and very like today.
Oh gosh, I'm going to have to check that one out. Thank you.
Yeah, it's by Christine Hanna.
Oh, perfect. We'll put a link in our podcast show notes so everybody can check that out. Any other books you'd recommend?
Yeah, and the other book is one that Greta Thunberg has been caught. I don't remember what it's called now because I haven't got it here, but that I would read after this one.
Oh,
and that will be good too.
That's going to be amazing. Yeah, I know there's a couple. I think the climate book, or that one is too small.
Yeah, the climate book. Yeah.
Okay, good. We'll put a link there. Some great recommendations. Thank you. Okay, 2 more things here. I love to ask my podcast guests that have had a career and still are doing amazing work is, if you look back, Pia, is there any career advice you wish you'd have known a little earlier?
No, it's difficult. Of course, I wanted to be an architect, became an engineer, but I soon realized that it's an engineer I am, sort of. So I'm glad I didn't become an architect, because I'm much more engineer than architect.
Yeah, well, and you've got to work on some amazing projects with a lot of great architects. So you probably still got to use a little of that great creativity there. And, just to echo something you said at the beginning, when you had the opportunity to become that environmental engineer and specialist, and you put yourself out there. So I would challenge our podcast listeners, who better than you to do that? And if it's like, yes, you know what, I can say yes to that, then sometimes you just got to go for it. And I see, Pia, that you've done that.
Yeah.
So my last question, as we wrap up, if there's someone listening to this podcast and they're just now jumping into the green building movement, do you have any words of encouragement for them?
That you can make so much difference. And I'm very interested in concrete and reducing carbon from concrete. You can do so much there. And it was a Swedish structural engineering consultancy company that looked at their carbon footprints, and they soon realized that whatever they did in their private life was like nothing compared what they could do in their professional life. Because carbon has such a high impact, both carbon and steel, and they're so easy to reduce that impact, like super easy to reduce. Yeah.
You got to do it, and it still can make good business sense. I'm seeing that definitely in your region. We do some work. You mentioned Skanska, of course. They're early and a lot of the low carbon concrete, and it sounds like you're seeing on other projects. It's just such an important place to start, because it's not just about operating carbon. How efficient will the building be, right? BREEAM and LEED and other programs will force us to be more efficient to run the building. But gosh, how about the materials? How about the embodied carbon? So, I think I'm hearing from you is so much opportunity. Get into this movement, help, but then maybe learn a little more on something big, like the low carbon concrete. It just makes sense.
Yes, of course. We've in Sweden we've been working with energy efficiency for so long time. So we're actually really good there. But the materials we haven't worked with. It's just the last few years.
It's amazing.
More carbon from the materials than from the running of the building.
You're right. We're seeing that shift. And in your region, it may already have happened. But in the next several years, the shift is the bigger energy consumption will have come from embodied carbon than operating. So it's so important that we get both right.
And also, of course, reuse, because there's we've been tearing down buildings built in the 70s, 80s, even 90s.
Yeah.
And that's not very sustainable.
Not at all. Not at all. Well, gosh, what a joy to get to know you better. We already know each other, and I learned a lot about you. And I hope our podcast listeners just loved hearing your story, your encouragement, hearing about your entrepreneurship, all these firsts that you've done in your region. And that, yes, it's a challenge. We need to make sure our rating systems, these great programs we use, that they do make the right adjustments, make it a little easier for more to get in and learn it. They're not behind, but then go apply it. And that's what I heard from you today, Pia. So thank you for your time. Hope everyone enjoyed getting to know you, and I hope you have an amazing day.
Yeah, or night.
Or night.
I just want to say thank you to our loyal listeners. We actually are celebrating over 1 year here on the Green Building Matters podcast. Me and the entire team were stoked and just so glad you continue to listen every Wednesday morning to a new interview with a green building professional here in this industry, or just some pro tips that we want to make sure that you are getting straight from us, straight to you. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Green Building Matters podcast. At gbes.com, our mission is to advance the green building movement through best-in-class education and encouragement. Remember, you can go to gbes.com/podcast for any notes and links that we mentioned in today's episode. And you can actually see the other episodes that have already been recorded with our amazing guests. Please tell your friends about this podcast. Tell your colleagues. And if you really enjoyed it, leave a positive review on iTunes. Thank you so much, and we'll see you on next week's episode.